Lucía Morales moved through the Whitmore mansion with the practiced invisibility that wealthy households demanded of their staff. Her footsteps disappeared into imported wool carpeting as she navigated the labyrinth of marble hallways and crystal-adorned rooms. The mansion breathed wealth from every surface, old money embedded in the patina of silver frames and new money shouting from the modernist sculptures acquired at last season's auctions. 23 rooms required her attention daily, but the nursery drew her like a sanctuary. Not because it was easier to clean, quite the opposite, with its perpetual disarray of educational toys that cost more than her monthly salary, but because of its solitary occupant. 6-year-old James Whitmore existed in a fortress of silence, diagnosed with selective mutism that had transformed him from heir apparent to family concern. Media mogul Henry Whitmore approached his son's condition like an underperforming investment, applying resources rather than attention. A rotation of speech therapists, child psychologists, and British-accented nannies moved through James's life with professional detachment, speaking about him rather than to him, while documenting incremental failures in leather-bound notebooks. On this particular Tuesday, rain lashed against leaded windows as thunder rolled across the Connecticut sky. Lucía entered the nursery to find it apparently empty, the usual scatter of building blocks abandoned. A soft rustling beneath the hand-painted activity table revealed James, his small shoulders hunched protectively over a crumpled page torn from a book. His crayon moved in frantic circles, pressing so hard the blue wax threatened to tear through the paper. The protocol was clear: call the nanny, document the behavior, maintain boundaries. Instead, Lucía quietly knelt down, her starched uniform crinkling at the knees. She didn't speak. Words had become barriers for James, not bridges. She simply reached for a discarded yellow crayon and began to draw on her own scrap of paper, a small bird with outstretched wings soaring above simplified clouds. James glanced up, suspicion gradually yielding to curiosity. When Lucía began humming a gentle melody from her childhood in Oaxaca, something in the boy's rigid posture softened almost imperceptibly. For 16 minutes, they existed in parallel, not touching, not speaking, but somehow no longer entirely separate. That evening, as Lucía retreated to her sparse quarters in the staff wing, she discovered James had slipped his drawing into her apron pocket. A circle of blue, with what might have been a face, or perhaps a moon, or simply the visual representation of how it felt to be perpetually observed but never seen. The next morning, as she entered the nursery with cleaning supplies, she found James waiting, eyes tracking the doorway long before she appeared. What began as coincidence became ritual. While Henry Whitmore orchestrated media empires from his Manhattan office and attended charity galas with interchangeable companions on his arm, Lucía built a different kind of foundation with his son, one crayon stroke at a time. She never mentioned these moments in her daily reports. Some connections existed beyond the transactional relationships of employment. Some silences held more meaning than the carefully crafted speeches echoing through the mansion's grand halls during Henry's frequent fundraisers. In the quiet of the nursery, something fragile and essential was taking root. In another life, Lucía might have stood before a classroom in Monterey, guiding young minds through the wonders of literature. Her acceptance to the teaching program had arrived the same week as her visa complications. Dreams deferred by a single governmental stamp, potential redirected by bureaucratic indifference. Now her classroom consisted of one silent student and the gathered shadows of the nursery. Each evening, after the mansion settled into its particular quietude, silver-polished, surfaces gleaming, appearances maintained, Lucía would slip into James's room with stories cradled like precious artifacts. El zorro pequeño no podía hablar, she would begin, her voice carrying the warmth of distant sunlight. The little fox couldn't speak, but he could listen, and in listening he learned the language of stars. James never responded verbally, but his responses evolved in subtle gradations that Lucía catalogued with private joy. a slight lean toward her voice, fingers brushing against illustrated pages, eyes tracking her movements with increasing trust. Eventually, a nod when she asked if he wanted another story. Progress measured in molecules of connection, rather than the developmental charts pinned to his therapist's clipboard. She drew from memories of her grandmother's tales, adapting them for this child of privilege, who somehow seemed starved for nourishment no amount of expensive nutrition consultants could provide. Stories of desert creatures finding courage, of children discovering hidden strengths within themselves, of voices lost and found again in unexpected places. On the night of Henry's annual media gala, the mansion transformed into a showcase of influence. Reporters arrived with photographers, business partners arrived with proposals, celebrities arrived with carefully cultivated personas. Amid the chaos, Lucía found James huddled in his closet, knees drawn to chest, overwhelmed by the intrusion of strangers into his carefully ordered world. "Está bien, pequeño," she soothed, sitting cross-legged on the closet floor, her uniform creasing in ways the housekeeper would surely notice. "The stars still know your name, even when you can't say theirs." "Estrellas," James whispered, his first word in months so soft it might have been imagined. When she mentioned this breakthrough to Henry later that evening, he barely glanced up from his phone. "That's what we pay the speech therapist for," he muttered, attention already diverted to an incoming text from a network executive. But when James began insisting on Lucía's presence during therapy sessions, clutching her hand and refusing to participate without her steady presence, the professionals took notice. And so, finally, did Henry. The suspicion that bloomed in his eyes carried equal parts confusion and resentment, the particular displeasure of a man accustomed to purchasing solutions rather than discovering them existed within his own household. "You're the maid, not his mother." Henry's voice sliced through the mahogany-paneled study, each word precisely weighted to remind Lucía of her position. The therapist's report lay open on his desk, its clinical language somehow more damning for its professional restraint. Remarkable progress, facilitated primarily through interaction with household employee Lucía Morales. Sunlight streamed through leaded windows, illuminating dust particles that danced between them, the only movement in an otherwise frozen tableau. Lucía stood, with hands clasped before her uniform, years of practiced deference warring with the fierce protectiveness she felt toward James. "I was only trying to help him, Mr. Whitmore," she replied, voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "Help him? Or use him to elevate yourself?" Henry's fingers drummed against the polished surface of his desk, an heirloom from a railroad baron 3 generations removed. "We have experts for his condition, professionals with credentials. You've overstepped, and it stops now. Pack your things. You're done here." The dismissal came with 2 weeks' severance, generous by legal standards, devastating by human ones. Lucía moved through her quarters with mechanical precision, placing modest belongings into a weathered suitcase her father had carried across 2 borders. Between folded uniforms, she tucked a small blue drawing she'd kept since that first rainy afternoon. A talisman of connection now severed. What followed was silence of a different kind. The mansion staff whispered that James refused food, threw himself into violent tantrums when approached by the new nanny, and reverted to complete mutism. 3 specialists resigned in succession, citing environmental factors in their departure letters. Desperate for answers, Henry reviewed security footage from the nursery cameras, installed for safety but rarely monitored by the man who commissioned them. What unfolded on the screen humbled him. Lucía, sitting patiently for hours, creating safe spaces for his son, speaking to him with dignity rather than condescension. In one sequence, James had dropped a cup of juice, his face crumpling in anticipation of reproval. Instead, Lucía had simply handed him a cloth, guiding his hand as they cleaned together, a lesson in consequences without shame. In the abandoned staff quarters, Henry discovered an envelope she'd left behind, an acceptance letter to Cornell's education program dated 3 years earlier. In the margin, Lucía had written, Perhaps someday. She had chosen to stay for James when her own dreams called elsewhere, a sacrifice invisible until its absence revealed its shape. 2 weeks later, Henry stood at the door of Lucia's modest apartment in Queens, James clutching his hand. The boy's eyes widened at the sight of her, a small sound escaping his throat that contained more emotion than words could hold. "I made a mistake," Henry admitted, the words unfamiliar on his tongue. "James needs you, not as our maid, as his teacher." Sunlight filtered through gossamer curtains patterned with constellations, casting dappled shadows across walls once stark with educational infographics. The former nursery had transformed into a space of possibility, where James sat engaged in animated conversation with 2 other children. The gardener's son with a stutter, and the daughter of Henry's executive assistant, who processed the world differently than most. "And then the fox taught all the other animals to listen to the stars," James explained, his vocabulary now flourishing like a garden finally given proper light. His hands moved in graceful arcs as he spoke, punctuating thoughts with the confidence of someone who had discovered the particular music of his own voice. Lucía observed from her desk, no longer wearing the uniform that had rendered her invisible, but dressed in the understated elegance of an educator who understood the weight of her calling. The transition hadn't been seamless. Power rarely relinquishes its shape without resistance. Her condition for returning had been absolute authority over James's educational environment, a demand Henry might once have found laughable, but now accepted with the humility of a man who had witnessed his own limitations. What began as intervention evolved into a curriculum tailored to the landscape of James's mind. His selective mutism, rather than a deficit to correct, became understood as part of his exquisite sensitivity to a world that moved too loudly, too carelessly. Under Lucia's guidance, his silence transformed from absence into a different form of presence. At the annual Whitmore Foundation Gala, Henry silenced the crowd with an uncharacteristic display of emotion. The assembled power brokers and influencers grew still as he departed from his usual polished script. "Many of you have inquired about my son's progress," he began, voice carrying the texture of newfound understanding. "What you don't know is that his greatest teacher wasn't found through my connections or wealth. She was already in our home, seeing what I was too blind to recognize." The Morales Whitmore Learning Center opened 6 months later in a renovated brownstone in Queens, a specialized school for children with communication differences, particularly those from immigrant families navigating multiple cultural contexts. Funded by Henry's foundation, but directed entirely by Lucía, who completed her long-deferred education degree with highest honors. In her office hung a simple blue circle with a face, the first words in a conversation that had transformed not just a child, but all who surrounded him. Beneath it, a small brass plaque read, "Every silence contains a voice, waiting to be heard."